long time in the Catholic Church, we had to cover our heads, and just all of a sudden they did away with eating meat on Friday, or you couldn't eat on Friday.
Yeah, Vatican II changed quite a lot back in 65 to 68, I think Vatican II was.
And now we don't have to cover our heads.
Okay, I'm just going to go quickly through what we covered last week. Just to remind you once again, we are listening in or reading in on one side of a conversation. Paul knew what the situation was in Corinth, and the Corinthians knew what the situation was in Corinth. We've got Paul's side of the conversation, and as we read the book of 1 Corinthians, we can only begin to, in some ways, just speculate somewhat. Now, I think you can make some reasoned reconstruction of the situation there in Corinth, but we have to admit that it is difficult to fully understand what the social situation was. I think the main themes, though, that Paul is trying to instruct here, as he's here in these collection of chapters is that he's trying to get the Corinthians to love one another. Not just to express their religious opinions, their religious conclusions, their religious practices, their spirituality. He was trying to get them to understand that your spirituality, even if it has a outwardly manifested sort of spiritual expression, either as a preacher or a prophet standing up and prophesying or speaking in tongues or being the spectacular gifts of healing, all of that outward things that would give people status. You know, because when you are able to speak well, if you show any kind of power, there's a tendency in humanity to exalt the loudest of us. The ones with the biggest personalities tend to get, what is it? The greasy wheel, or the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And those that squeak tend to be the ones that get all of the emphasis, and they are the ones that are able to control things. And Paul is trying to get them to think, just because you've got freedom doesn't mean you just automatically exercise it. You need to reflect upon the status of the gospel being most important. Does this glorify the gospel? Does it glorify Christ? And does it build up your neighbor? And so that's kind of the background issue that's being involved here. And he's already told them in the previous chapter about how, listen, when I came, I basically worked in order to support myself. I wasn't one of these guys passing the offering plate. Although technically passing the offering plate for the ministry, nothing wrong with. He's not running down anybody that makes their living from ministering the gospel. But he was basically saying, I'm not here to exalt power and status. I'm here for the gospel. Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. And then he addresses this issue. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. And now he's going to deal with this issue with regards to the something that was specifically happening in the Corinthian church. Now, while we don't know exactly the details, I think you could make some reasoned reconstruction ideas that apparently there were some women in the congregation who were very encouraged by the gospel, had gotten saved, and had begun to manifest spiritual gifting. And some of it, according to this reconstruction idea, it was going to their head that they felt the perfect freedom, now that they had the freedom to be involved in the spirit, the religion that they were involved with. They had the freedom to interrupt the preacher. They had even the freedom that they no longer had to show public respect for their husbands, because that would have been an expected custom in the day that you don't run down your husband, you don't flirt with other men when you're in public. You certainly show respect and decorum toward your husband. And some of the women, according to this reconstructed idea, were beginning to exert themselves in the services, sometimes even interrupting possibly their husband, who might have stood up and say, "I've got a prophetic word, thus and thus and thus," and then his wife popping up and say, "Well, honey, you need to, no, that's not right, honey. It's this and this and this." And this was showing a sort of misunderstanding. It was communicating a thought that when you get saved by the gospel of Jesus Christ, you then have the right to be disrespectful to your spouse in public. And thus the reputation of the gospel is affected. Some of them were feeling so free, if this is a proper reconstruction, they thought, well, now since we can wear our hair however we want to, I don't care what sort of message my hairstyle communicates. In our day and age, hairstyles are generally whatever. It generally doesn't communicate a whole lot necessarily about a woman's character just automatically. But back then, in most of the artwork, you found, when you look at the artwork there, the wives, the women of decorum and dignity wore their hair up onto their heads. And it was always properly put up, and you see that in the artwork. You see it in the statues, you see it in the carvings and different things like that. And so the theory is that a woman who had a proper decorum, showing respect for her husband, she put her hair up on her head. But women who were single, or prostitutes, or pagan priestesses, they let their hair hang low, have it unloosened. You know, what was that old, that Charlie Rich song, "When We Get Behind Closed Doors"? She lets her hair hang what? Down. And that is a communication of flirtatious sexual connotations, if that's the proper understanding of what's going on here. And so here he is introducing a theological idea. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man. He's the director. He's the source of life. He directs every man. And the man is the head of a woman. And the husband is the director of the wife. And God is the head of Christ. And it should be, ideally, there should not be conflict between a head and body, because it should be a fellowship between the two. There shouldn't be conflict between the two. Every man who has something on his head, or as I mentioned last week, every man who has down his head, is what it literally is, while praying or prophesying, disgraces his head. One of the theoretical reconstructions of understanding that phrasing, every man who has down his head, the idea was that there was an idea that some men in Corinth were wearing their hair in feminine hairstyles, and their hair was down their head. In fact, I think there are some references that talk about, in the Greco-Roman world, that some men were styling their hair, some men were putting maybe beads in it or something like that. In other words, that's the proper reconstruction, every man who looks feminine while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. And I think he's having a double meaning. He disgraces not only himself by not looking masculine. Who is the head of every man according to the previous verse? Christ. And so he's disgracing Christ by having this feminized look in the congregation. And so if that's the proper background here, that would be a way to understand this particular statement. But every woman who has her head uncovered, and that's the assumption, her hair is uncovered by her hairstyle that would typically be understood, showing proper decorum by having her hair, long hair up on her head, while praying or prophesying, disgraces her head. Either her head or her own noggin, or whether her husband, or maybe even her father, if you looked at it that way. But one thing that needs to be pointed out here, the assumption is women are praying and prophesying in the church. This is not a condemnation of women praying and prophesying. This is saying women who pray and prophesy shouldn't just do it with no thought to how it expresses your relationships. It should be done with proper decorum, proper dignity. You don't just say, well, I got the Spirit. I can wear my hair however I want to. I can do whatever because I've got the Spirit. Every woman who has her head in a wild hairstyle, if that's the understanding, contextually to first century Corinth, disgraces her head. For she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. The idea is that women who were shamed publicly, they would have their hair shaved off. It happened in World War II to the women who were collaborating with the Nazis in France. After they freed France, freed Paris, they took these collaborating women, put them in the public square, and they took the razors and they shaved their heads to say these women are disgraceful to the French public because of their collaboration with the Nazis. And he's trying to say here, culturally, if you don't have a sense of decorum in the way you present yourself, you are acting shamefully. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. Now, of course, this raises the issue, of how do we take this. If you just take this as a flat verse, you read the Bible just as a flat literal text, then basically all of you ladies are in violation of this verse because you have cut your hair. You've cut your hair, and some of you even got it hanging too low. But there are even people that come to our church service and they've got long hair hanging down. If you read this in a flat way, I think proper biblical interpretation asks itself. We don't just read the text in a flat way. We also say, what was the main point of this? Proper decorum to represent the gospel. We certainly, all of us, I have not obeyed the Bible for all 57 of my years because I have never greeted anybody with a holy kiss when I come to church. But what was the point I've tried to remind you of? It's not the literal flat text, it's what's the point of the text. Greet one another with a warm greeting that welcomes you into the fellowship. That's what a holy kiss is about. This is not primarily about whether you ladies have long hair or short hair or anything like that. It is, what does your appearance create a distress culturally so that you're interrupting the very point of the assembly? Are you in defiance of your husband by your hairstyle or however you're expressing yourself? It's about attitude, and I think that's what he's trying to convey here. If a woman has a arrogant, bossy, mouthy attitude, that disgraces the gospel. It disgraces her husband. And you could flip the whole thing to say, what about men that strut around and boss everybody around. Does that exalt Christ? Well, you'd say, well, of course it doesn't. This is all about the church examining their hearts and their lives to say, is my demeanor in public worship, how does it promote Christ? How does it promote the message we have? And do I, by my actions and my general demeanor, does it promote something different? You know, if I were to come in here on Sunday mornings and come strutting in with gold cufflinks and diamonds and all, and just exalting all this power, me driving up in a Rolls Royce, and y'all have to roll a red carpet out for me. In fact, we need just a red carpet down here for me to come walking in, and I'll wave to all of you. That would convey the wrong image of the ministry of the gospel. Our outward expression first impressions, has an impact on people. The way people see you, we express ourselves. And here I think Paul is picking up on that. In this particular issue in Corinth, you had this situation of people taking their freedom and running wild with it. For a man ought not to have his head covered. He ought not to have a feminine hairstyle where he puts his hair all up in a fancy style, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. The woman shows her dignity by not being disgraceful, especially in contrast in relationship with her husband. For a man does not originate from woman. This is recalling, of course, the creation story, Genesis 2. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. He's recalling this creation story to say, theologically, this is more than just you being an independent person. There's a relationship between husband and wife. Therefore, the woman ought to have, and I remind you, that word assemble of is not in the original text. This is an interpretive translation. It is, you could say it's a proper translation. You could make the case that it's talking about a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. Literally, though, the text says, therefore the woman ought to have authority on her head, or have authority over her head. And the idea here is this talking about women ought to have a veil on her head, or some sort of hat on her head, or some sort of covering or cloth on her head? And that's why I even knew a woman in seminary, and she always had a hat on when she went to church, because she read that verse, and she said, oh, this is talking about God got to have a hat on. Well, I've said many times, I only get a few hats in this congregation on Easter, and I don't even get that. Is that what this is talking about? No, I think a case could be made. Therefore, the woman ought to have authority over her head. She ought to think, how do I need to present myself with regards to my respect to my husband in that Corinthian context in the first century? She ought to take control of her freedom in Christ and say, it communicates the wrong idea when I wear my hair loose and flowing, because it communicates the wrong ideas about whether I'm trying to flirt with the other men in the congregation. Instead, I need to communicate, I am a wife, I am dedicated to my husband, and I'm not going to let that dedication to my husband be interrupted by somebody seeing my loose hairstyle that looks like prostitutes or pagan priestesses. Instead, I'm going to show myself as a proper, dignified, respectful wife to my husband. Now, of course, that's contextual to this church, but the idea is she's going to take control of her freedom in order to have more proper presentation because of the angels. Several different ways to look at this. The idea of the angels that lusted after women in Genesis 6, that's one background possibility. Another one is the idea that angels are in the presence of every worship service. I can feel the brush of angels' wings. I see glory on each face. And the idea is you shouldn't have a disrespectful attitude to your husband. Angels are present. They're looking at what sort of a presentation do you want to give the idea that I'm independent and I don't care what anybody thinks. There are angels observing the congregation. Another third way to look at it is one day you're going to judge angels. So if you don't have control of yourself now, how in any way can you judge an angel at the end of the age? And so that might be kind of what's being said here. However, now this is where Paul is trying to get to the very core of the thing. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. The battle of the sexes is not a good thing. This life is about learning to get along, and it's hard to get along. We don't understand each other. It almost seems like we're two different species. And yet, the gospel is to bring male and female together, especially expressed in marriage. And there needs to be an idea theologically that neither is the woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. Both sexes demonstrate the image of God. For as the woman originates from the man, Genesis 2, so also the man has his birth through the woman. That's all of human history. And all things originate from God. That's why we need to always realize how theology is the core of loving your neighbor. How do you love your neighbor? You get the proper theology. How does God involve in this interrelationship with one another? Now here Paul very well could have laid down the law and say, I'm just going to tell you what you're supposed to do. But I think he was trying to invite them to really reflect upon. I think he was trying to persuade them more than dictate to them. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered, with her head displaying proper dignity, or her head displaying openness and flirtatiousness? That's kind of the idea, if I've reconstructed the background to this sort of communication. Think about it. Because he's going to eventually get to chapter 13. And what's chapter 13 in 1 Corinthians? It's the love chapter. Behave yourself towards your neighbors with an eye toward, is this the best expression of love for your neighbor? And most especially, what's the best expression of love for the gospel and Christ? Does not eat. Now this is also another sentence that's hard to understand. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? And I ask, how does nature teach you that? Well, you've got to understand, how does that word nature, how is it understood in the first century? Not how we understand it. We just understand nature as that stuff out there, trees and all that sort of thing. That word, that term, does not even the way things are. That's kind of what nature is in this context. The way things are itself teach you that if a man doesn't, ordinary custom teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him. Isn't the way of expressing masculinity in general, within the custom understood, it is men look better with shorter hair than they do with long hair. Now, I'll concede, I've seen a few men that look pretty good with long hair. They're very rare. There are some that go, yep, you can pull it off. And then there are others, I think, you just need to cut your hair. Especially, I've seen some older men in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think, just cut your hair. Now, if you're Native American, I'll give you a pass. Some Native American men look good and cool.
All the men in the Old Testament with long hair.
Well, you know, and even then, that's even, you know, those sorts of things like that. To me, that communicates this is a cultural thing in a particular context. Does not even first century social customs teach you. So, in the context of it was the 50s of the first century in Greco-Roman Corinth, in general, short hair on men conveyed masculinity, long hair on men communicated femininity. In other contexts, long hair wasn't an issue. Like for Samson, because that's whole culturally a whole different place. Paul is making the appeal of, in the situation you're in, have your eyes open enough to say, what am I communicating by my appearance? Am I helping the gospel or am I hurting the gospel? Am I helping social interactions or am I just being a contrarian? Just, pushing buttons because I just like making people upset. It is a dishonor to him. But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her. I mean, I think one thing that men need to understand, a woman spending time with her hair, that's very important to her. One thing I do say to couples when I'm doing premarital counseling, I say, listen, if both of you are starting to lose your hair, dude, if you got to spend money on getting your hair restored, that money goes to her. Because her hair is more important to her than it is to you. It's okay to be a bald man. Because a woman's hair is important to her, or in general to most. There's always exceptions and all. But here, for her hair is given to her for a covering. And that's, to me, one of the reasons why that speculation that this is talking about the hairstyle being styled upward is that was understood. Why do women have long hair? So that they can properly arrange it up on their head in order to be a dignity in public, showing decorum to their husbands. Now, when you're behind closed doors, you let your hair hang low, whatever, that's in private. That's between a husband and his wife. But here he's trying to convey that I think the idea that public display conveys messages, and you need to be reflective of that. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. He's not laying the law down saying, you've got to follow me on this. He's just saying, listen, guys, I don't know what else to tell you. When you meet together, you need to be reflective upon how do you express your relationships in your marriages and in the General Assembly. Are you doing something that's disruptive, or are you doing something that is cohesive, that brings you together? Now, I'm just going to briefly get into this next section. But in giving this instruction, and meaning the instruction that he's going to in the rest of this chapter, I do not praise you, because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, when you're fellowshipping together, I hear that divisions exist among you. I hear that, and I'm kind of persuaded that that's real. And in part, I believe it. You can't just say, well, you just heard one side of the argument, Paul. We don't really have divisions. Actually, I've heard enough from y'all. Yeah, y'all got some real problems in your fellowship. Apparently, and this is the reconstructed idea that he is mentioned more explicitly in a moment, they were having fellowship meals. And people were hungry at fellowship meals. And the richest people who had the most ability to get food were the ones that were showing up early to eat the meal, and at the end of by the time you got the line of the rest of them, the poor people who had to be at work, by the time they got to there, they had very few food there. I heard about a rock band, their record label was celebrating that they had just, their album had gone platinum, and they had, let's have a big party celebrating the album's gone platinum. They've sold all this, and they invited all the executives and all the girlfriends and all, and they had this huge feast, and when the band got there, they took all the pictures, and the band was hungry, and they go up to the party table that was in honor of them selling the platinum albums, and they didn't have any food. They had cleaned out that entire table. He says there might have been a piece of bread and a chicken wing. We were the guys they were having the party for, and we didn't get a thing. The fellowship at the Corinth church, the rich people who had plenty of food at their house would come early because they didn't have to work, and they were clearing out the fellowship banquet table. And the poor people who had to work and just barely got there, they'd come, and there's nothing. How does that show your spirituality? And that's what Paul's going to address next. What in particular